What's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and today I want to talk to you all a little bit about 9.0.5, but really 9.1 PTR and the changes that I hope we're going to see for Covenants heading into both patches. Now, Blizzard has mentioned that 9.0.5 is going to be their tuning patch of sorts, which we haven't really seen in the past, but I think looking at how Shadowlands is structured, with Covenants being such a big choice, conduits, soulbinds requiring a lot of time and effort being put into them, I think it's good to actually have the changes set for next patch, which is what I'm assuming they're doing with 0.5, ready and just in position, I guess, in place for future reference. So let's, for example, I don't want to be swapping from Night Fae to Venthyr the week before the raid drops because some huge buff ended up coming in. Now, I guess tuning will happen probably a bit over the course of 9.1, but I'm happy to see that Blizzard's messing with it over the course of 0.5 PTR. We're going to start off with Venthyr and then go through all the other three covenants, talking a decent bit, really just about the main ability being Soul Rot, Decimating Bolt, Scouring Tide, and Impending Catastrophe. Where they're good, where they're bad, where I'd like to see changes, what changes I like to see, and then also talking a bit about the actual conduit that affects the ability, because there have been some changes to legendary, some just to baseline spells, some for Venthyr, that make the conduits a bit more valuable, a bit less valuable, and just put them in a different spot to where they are on live right now. Any weak auras, profiles, or add-ons just here, you can grab for free off my Twitch. If you want to swing by, hang out, feel free to do so. So with that being said, let's start off with the covenant that I wish I was playing the most, but I'm a Night Fae instead, Venthyr. I have to say, I have not been in the Venthyr Sinfall class hall in a while. It's actually pretty cool being back here, but I'm not getting my hopes up for 9.1. Regardless though, so we're not going to be talking a whole lot about the actual Door of Shadows, Fleshcraft, whatever abilities that each covenant has, because they're generic across every class and they're going to be probably tuned a bit too, and that's just, yeah, you know, more focused on the actual Warlock abilities here. So the Warlock ability for Venthyr, in case somebody doesn't know, is Impending Catastrophe. Now this basically calls forth the cloud of anima that you launch at your target. It will deal damage to enemies in its path and then explode when it hits the target, applying either Curse of Weakness or Curse of Tongues to the targets that I guess it AoEs explodes upon, I guess, and puts a dot on them for 12 seconds. Now, this ability is really cool because unlike Night Fae Soul Rot, it's not target capped. So it does gain a lot of value, and plus, regardless of what spec you're playing, if you're pulling 2 packs, 3 packs, and even if you're just pulling 1 pack, once again, the fact that it applies Curse of Weakness and Curse of Tongues to mobs is really strong. This ability does Smart Curse, meaning that it'll apply weakness to melee based mobs, it'll apply tongues to caster based mobs. This was a change they made in very late beta, which is awesome. It was a wanted and suggested change we made for a while, because it would randomly throw weakness on a healer and tongues on like a melee mob. It was terrible. But having that be smart, having it Smart Curse now, means it is a lot just better. It's more impactful, and plus, because it adds a lot of utility to a group, even though which we're going to sort of get to in a minute here, the damage might not be as strong as, well, we'd like it to be. So those are the positives with Impending Catastrophe. Now, if you're playing Affliction, this ability does indeed count towards Malefic Rapture's dot count. This is going to drive me insane. I got to move up. The dot does indeed count towards Malefic Rapture's dot count. And like I said, it's not target capped. So if you, it also lasts 12 seconds too. So you can sort of work this into your actual rotation, maybe before your Vile Taint or your PS or whatever dot you want to put up later, and still get a lot of value out of that 12-second dot. And hey, your tank is probably going to love you for the weakness and tongues that you put out. So that's the good part about Catastrophe. Unfortunately, the bad part about Catastrophe is, well, the ability is just bad damage-wise. It's just not very strong. It is untarget cap, there's no cap on it, but the trade-off there is that the damage it deals is not very impressive. It's not super impactful. That's foregoing the rapture damage and the extra dot that it brings. Just the raw damage that it deals, we're talking AoE here, is not incredibly impressive. If you're pulling, you know, 2, 3, 4 packs, you can actually cast it and get the dot out on your mob. Sure, that's great, that's cool, but at the same time, other classes just have uncapped abilities that scale pretty well too, or I guess Covenant abilities to buff them. So the one thing I like to see with Catastrophe is probably a bit of a buff to its actual AoE damage. Now, they did nerf Catastrophe, I believe, like towards the end of beta, and then buffed it a tiny bit like 3 hours before Shadowlands went live. They buffed it again recently, both the impact damage and the actual dot, which is semi-substantial. I think it helps AF most, being real here, but I think it could use more of a buff. Even though Night Fae is capped at 4 or 5 targets, depending on what you do and with all that stuff, I think IC just needs a bit of a bump AoE wise. Now, if you're looking at pure single target, this ability is also very bad. It still counts towards Malefic dot count, but unlike Night Fae, this ability, it just doesn't do anything in single target. And the actual curse application, even though it's really cool, and like, hey, you should probably be putting a weakness on a boss or tongues or whatever. Anyways, it'll save you a little time there. It's still just really, really disappointing. Now, if you look at the actual Night Fae ability, Soul Rot deals is twice the damage to your priority target, the one that you are actually hitting and attacking. The dot will deal twice the damage. I think that's that's like the second change that I like to see for IC. Just have it deal twice the amount of damage, or some kind of extra modifier to the target that will bump it up in single target, but also not make it completely irrelevant in AoE. Yeah, it'll deal more damage to your main target in, Mythic Plus on trash pulls, but that's fine. Night Fae does too, Now, Night Fae Soul Rot dot also hits a good bit harder on surrounding mobs compared to IC. But once again, it's capped at 4 mobs. So if you pull a pack of 8 mobs, well, only 4 are going to be hit by that. So you're not getting the actual raw rapture value that you do playing Impending Catastrophe. The third change I like to see here. So number 1, AoE damage bump up. Number 2, a single target increase, because let's be real here. I mean, most of the applications for this actual talent are in Mythic Plus. There aren't really a whole lot of boss fights where you're going to be putting up like IC for the Curse of Weakness and Curse of whatever, Tongues ability, right? You might get it somewhere like on Sun King Salvation for a little bit of value, for example, but it's just not really worthwhile. It's more of a plus ability, I believe there have been a couple people who have actually swapped the Venthyr just for the actual ability and plus. I don't think it's a great idea, but regardless, it's much more plus centric, right? So sort of staying with that general train of thought here, when you actually cast Impending Catastrophe, now depending on range here, it varies a bit, but there is a lot of travel time with IC. It's like a bomb that you throw at the actual mob, but there's probably 1.5 to 2 seconds worth of travel time there. Now, Necrolord Decimating Bolt is also the same way, which we'll get to in a little bit, but I would like to see the travel time reduced on IC, because depending on what you're doing, it does sort of make it awkward when you're trying to cast IC and then go into your Dark Glare, but there's travel time. You can sort of swap the way you cast dots around a little bit, but the ability is awesome. It looks really cool, but I just think practicality wise, the actual travel time of IC probably could be decreased by about half, and it would actually change things for the better as far as Plus is concerned. The other thing that I want to reference here and talk about is the actual conduit. So I'll be real with you, I actually had to read this thing because it's been a long time since I looked at this thing. Catastrophic Origin. So Impending Catastrophes damage over time, and the inflicted curse lasts 75% longer against your primary target. So number 1, primary target. That means that it's not going to last longer against the other ones, right? I can't really slot this thing because I don't have soul binds unlocked, but it's just, so if they increase the actual, it's frustrating in a sense here, because they increase the actual duration of Curse of Tongues from 30 seconds to 1 minute on PTR, I think last build or so, and weakness is 2 minutes by itself. So it's only your primary target, and regardless, I mean, it's 1 minute and 2 minutes. If you're in plus, I don't think a trash pack's living more than 1 minute unless it's like a mini boss. And if it's like 2 minutes, I mean, you can just reapply these anyways, regardless, right? But the big frustration here is there's no damage tied into this conduit. Now, I'm not like crazy excited about them tying, a Night Fae like single target double damage amp into this, but I think with them changing the way the Curse of Tongues and weakness are actually implemented, or I guess the duration of them in game, more so tongues here, there probably needs to be some kind of change made to Catastrophic Origin. The dot lasting 75% longer is fine, but I mean, even with like AF playing Dark Lair extension, it's probably going to be irrelevant. I guess it makes a bit more sense for Destro and Demo if you're playing this, but 12 seconds for the most part, it lasts 12 seconds baseline, and when you add in the 74% increase, it's probably like what, 19, 20-ish, give or take a little bit. It's just not as impactful as you'd hope it to be, and to be fair, I don't think any of the actual Covenant conduits are crazy strong, but the Night Fae Soul Rot one is hands down stronger than this, I feel, and that's taking a lot into account. So I think they need to readdress this conduit here as well, probably shift some kind of weird like curse duration increase to maybe like a single target damage amp. Once again, I don't want to have that tied just into this conduit because it might sort of like pigeonhole you into it if it's worthwhile, or just make it some weird way where they don't have to actually adjust IC. But both Catastrophic Origin and IC really need to be looked at. I like the curse effect of IC. I think it's cool, but the damage is just not there. The nerfs that came to this like a few weeks before beta was over were just completely unjustified. It's been buffed 3 times since then, and it's just still not good. It's really cool that it's uncapped because there's not a lot of abilities in game that are totally uncapped right now. So they have to be very careful with the actual uncapping of this, especially for AF with Rapture, you know, dot scaling. We know Rapture's a bit of an issue right now anyways, but I think the single target damage needs to be addressed. The AoE damage, the actual dot needs to be addressed. And the Catastrophic Orange's conduit probably needs to be addressed as well because, well, you know, curses lasting longer when they're 1 minute and 2 minutes, and the real relevancy of this is in plus doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table conduit wise. I suppose one way you probably could adjust the single target damage of Impending Catastrophe would actually be to make it deal like double damage if the explosion only hits 1 target. That way you can sort of leave it the way it is now, even though once again the dot probably needs to be buffed by a tiny bit on multiple targets, but it wouldn't be crazy with Rapture, and it would also be pretty good in raiding if you're hitting 1 target, whether it be a patchwork fight or just using it on cooldown when ads aren't up. That would actually probably be a pretty good way to address the issue. If it hits 1 target, it deals twice the amount of damage, which is similar to Night Fae, but not the exact just copy paste from Night Fae, giving a bit of uniqueness to Venthyr. It sort of makes sense too. It sort of fits the Venthyr theme. Hopefully that's one way they consider addressing and resolving the issue of, well, I guess the lack of single target damage with IC. Taking a look at Kyrian Warlocks, I'm going to be real. Kyrian's the one covenant that I guess Kyrian and Night Fae, but more so Kyrian is the one that I don't really think needs a tremendous amount of work or changes. It's just sort of a vanilla, like generic kind of ability that just, I guess, is there, and it just works for every spec decently. There are some cool tricks you can do. The ability is called Scouring Tide. For those who aren't familiar with it, it deals damage instantly, and it's a dot that goes in the mob as well. This dot does indeed count towards AF's Malefic Rapture dot count. It is indeed extendable by your Dark Glare. If the target dies when Scouring Tide is on it, you generate 5 soul shards. Now, that's basically like a Baleful Invocation-esque ability for AF, Destro, Demo, whatever spec. If they survive and Scouring Tide essentially ends the dot, the cooldown is refreshed. So as far as AF goes, this is a dot that you can basically maintain the entire time on like a patchwork fight. And if it's a fight with ads present, you can sort of like play it by putting it on a mob, for example, like let's say Sun King Salvation. You can put it on a mob until when they die, get those 5 shards back after you've dumped a few raptures, and then put it towards more raptures, which is great. As far as Destro is concerned, Destro is the spec I feel like, I mean, they're both solid, Destro and AF with this, but the cool thing with Destro is that you can Havoc Scouring Tide. Let me actually drag this out. So you can put like your Havoc up, for example, on this mob, go to this one here, cast your Scouring Tide, and it will go on both mobs. It's here and it's here. You can see it on both. And the really cool thing is that if one mob dies with it active and one doesn't, you'll get the shards, but then the other mob not dying but having Tide expire on it will reset the cooldown. You'll see it reset right here. It's really, really cool, and it works really well with Destro Havoc. I had a pretty good, I guess, we played it on Sun King Salvation on most of beta testing, and when the fight was a little different in beta, but you had so many shards coming in when one mob would die. But if you put it on like the higher, like general, like Goliath, whatever it's called in that fight, and got the reset as well, it was just like a huge fueling of shards over and over and over. It was really, really strong, albeit at times a little hard to leverage the actual refund because you can't totally control when mobs are going to die and when they're not. That's one of the downsides I feel about Scouring Tide, a bit for AF, but also for, you know, Destro as well. Demonology, it's fine. It's like your second Baleful Invocation because your Tyrant has, you know, 5 shards whenever you summon it, and this thing sort of is that way as well. Now, Demonology generates shards the fastest, I feel. You know, for the most part, you cast a Shadow Bolt, you get a shard. Destro is partial shards, and, well, AF is like, you know, random Agony shard generation, or I guess Drain Soul sniping with UA, with or without UA. I feel that the biggest issue with Scouring Tithe is leveraging the shards when a mob is dying. But if you're paying attention to it, for the most part, you can actually do it pretty well and I guess relatively easy. I just think that it benefits AF and Destro a decent bit more than it does Demonology. For Demo, it's pretty much just a dot you put up. You sort of just set it and forget it. And if you get the shards, great. If you don't, all right, well, you just put it back up. But it doesn't really have like... It has some AoE implications. You can sort of play it. It's just sort of like I said, a weird vanilla set it and forget it kind of ability. When it comes to the conduit though, for this actually, it's called Soul Tithe. Now this is where it gets interesting, and I wouldn't mind this conduit being, I guess, revisited in a sense. When your target dies under the effect of Scouring Tithe. So number one, it takes the target dying to get the actual effect of this conduit. You gain 16% increased damage to your Chaos Bolt for 10 seconds. It's Chaos Bolt for Destro, Rapture for Affliction, and your demons gain, you know, the same percent increase for Demo. So with Demo, you can sort of play this to have a pretty big damage increase to your pets potentially if you play it right and leverage it right. For Destro, I mean, yeah, you can get a Chaos Bolt increase, it's awesome. And for AF, you can get a Rapture increase. But the problem with this conduit is that it has to have the target die with Scouring Tithe on it. One of the things with Scouring Tithe is that the target, if it doesn't die, it's refresh, which I guess you get value from there. But I mean, in certain settings, you can't guarantee this conduit giving you value. I guess spoilers ahead, Night Fae always gives you value. Venthyr always gives you value. I think Necrolord, the weird one, it's garbage, but it still always gives you value. This conduit can just be dead at times in certain settings. And I guess you're getting, once again, the ability to put Tithe back up, but it just feels sort of awkward, you know? You can leverage the bonus for Demo with pet damage. You can sort of make, you know, maybe a Havoc window for Chaos Bolts with Destro, and with AF, you get extra Rapture value. But at the same time, if mobs are dying, you already don't get value if mobs aren't dying. And if mobs are dying or the target dies, and let's say there's not a mob in the pack that has like a pretty low health pool, they're all about the same, are you really going to be able to leverage that damage amp for 10 seconds on your demons or on your raptures or on your bolts? It's sort of awkward, right? So I like the idea and the premise behind Soul Tithe. Me personally, I just don't think it fits very well. It's dead, completely dead at certain times, and when it's active, at times the pack's just gonna be dying and you're gonna get no value out of this unless your tank is chain pulling into the next pack. And depending what you're doing, I mean, AF's not gonna open up with raptures on a pack. You have to dot things. I guess Demo could sort of like have some imps rolling, and I guess Destro could launch a Chaos Bolt or two, but you typically don't open a Chaos Bolt, you open on like a Kata into a CDF or some Immos or whatever. You know, it just, the value is there. It's just like, it's hard to get the value. So I'm not really disappointed with Scouring Tithe. It's a permanent dot for AF on a patchwork fight, or gives you shards. You can Havoc it as Destro. As Demo, you can get 2 Baleful Invocations in a sense if you play it right. And if not, it's just sort of there. I just think Soul Tithe probably needs to be re-looked at, re-evaluated heading into 9.1, because I mean, let's be real here, like none of the conduit or Covenant conduits are crazy impactful, but this is the one I think is the worst and probably needs to be revisited. At times you just get like no value out of it, and it's really awkward. So when it comes to Night Fae, I can just get on live because this is the Covenant that we've played for a long time. Night Fae, it's just good. The ability is generic. It deals the same, it does the same thing across every spec, right? It counts as a dot for Affliction, for Rapture. It is extended by your Dark Glare. For Destro, it's just the damage is strong. It's powerful. This is what we're talking about with Venthyr, right? Initially, Soul Rot didn't deal more damage to the main target. It just put a dot out on like four targets total, and if you cast your Drain Life, it would hit all of them. Spoilers ahead, boys. You still don't cast Drain Life. The second part of this paragraph right here, you can sort of see like I don't know, some part of the screen here. Just cut that off. No one cares about Drain Life, which is probably my biggest point of my biggest issue with this ability. We'll get to that in a minute. The damage is just good, whatever you do, because number one, the single target damage, the damage to your main target, is doubled on this ability. The dot that goes into the 4 mobs is also good. It does more damage than Impending Catastrophe does for Venthyr. It lasts 4 seconds less than Venthyr, but it still counts as a dot for Rapture. It's still extendable by your Dark Glare. It's still just good. Now, we didn't talk a whole about Soul Binds, obviously, because the other ones, it just is a bit. But, man, Nia with your Invigoration, so good. This mastery buff being tied to your 1 minute cooldown, which lines up with your Dark Glare, with your Infernal, with your Tyrant playing Wilford's, is just so incredibly strong. And that's not whether it's mastery or the stamina you went for Demo, because Demo is just in a weird spot right now. But It's just really strong. And unlike it being, you know, good for Destro but mediocre for Demo and bad for AF like Necrolord is, which we'll get to after this, it's just a good ability. It beats out this is why I think we know Night Fae is the best universal covenant for Warlocks. If you want to play Destro and you enjoy Necrolord, go for it. It's fine, because Necrolord is good for Destro. It's a bit better than Night Fae for just Destro. But if you're looking at playing all 3 specs in a progression setting in Mythic Plus, Night Fae is the way to go. AoE wise, solid. It's probably arguably our best, like, I guess, capped AoE ability, comparing it to IC, but the master buff, very good. Single target wise, a bit worse than Necrolord for Destro, and a tiny bit worse, I believe, still than Kyrian is for Affliction single target. But Kyrian doesn't have any AoE implications. It doesn't do anything really, right? Like, Necrolord doesn't really have many AoE implications either. None for Demo, and Havoc, Incinerate for Destro. Let's be real here, no one's playing Fire and Brimstone. Night Fae can hit 4 mobs. It has AoE implications, it has single target implications, and it's good in a raid setting. Now, like I did say, my biggest complaint with this ability is that you just don't cast Drain Life. The ability is strong on its own, but even if you're playing Affliction with Inevitable Demise, you're not doing in the first place, because Drain Soul is very good. And if you're playing ID, I mean, you're probably playing it in Plus or on some fight in the raid, which there's none in this tier, but maybe on a fight in the raid where you can get a lot of value and then AoE it down. The problem is, on those fights, I hate having these 2 abilities in the same row here, because on those fights, Drain Soul is probably going to be pretty good. Drain Soul is very good in Plus because of the shard sniping and what it does. It feeds you more raptures. It shadows and break stacking as well. So that's super awkward. Outside of playing ID, you never hit Drain Life with this ability unless you're going to die. That's literally it. You never hit it. That second paragraph there, just cut it off. It doesn't do anything. That's my biggest complaint with Soul Rot. It's been that way since literal alpha, and it was never addressed. Now, like I said, Soul Rot is strong on its own, whether you're playing Destro or Demo or AF. AF has extra potential because of ID that Destro and Demo don't have. I wouldn't mind seeing this conduit. It's actually learned here, not in my bags. I wouldn't mind seeing Soul Eater maybe, instead of increasing Soul Rot's damage, have it increase Drain Life's damage. I don't know how much that would actually do, and it might actually be a little worse than just straight up increasing Soul Rot's damage, because, I mean, it is still strong at AoE. But I think there needs to be some kind of shift in the power, maybe, to making Drain Life relevant. Now, it might not be, listen, I totally get that it might not be like the competitive play, what everyone wants to see competition wise, when it comes to, like, you know, like competing in a PvE and a high-end level of things. But having an ability that has a portion you don't even bother hitting, it's not a good look. It's not a good look. It just sort of screams subpar design, and the fact that we just haven't looked at it in 6 months is sort of scary. So I think the biggest change for Night Fae, there needs to be some reason you hit Drain Life, whether it's single target, maybe just like how they increased the Soul Rot damage on single target, maybe they double Drain Life damage in single target, or increase it to a certain point where it's relevant to hit in single target. And maybe, like, Soul Rot on multiple mobs increases the value of Soul Rot, maybe to a lesser extent, but on those mobs outside of your main priority target in an AoE setting. I'm sure they can find some way to tune that. It might need to be knocked down a little bit, like single target wise and AoE wise, but I think that'd be okay. I think it'd be an okay trade-off, and I think for the most part that probably would be relatively well received. I mean, it doesn't really change a whole lot. You're only casting 1 drain every minute or so after this. And listen, like, I like Soul Rot the way it is, but I think actually having relevancy to the second half of this ability would be a good change. I'd like it just generic, tied into the ability here. But once again, if they wanted to tie it into Soul Eater, I guess I'd take it. It probably wouldn't see much play, because once again, these conduits don't see play really in general, which they should. They need to be looked at and tuned. But I think that probably more or less needs to be baked into the actual Soul Rot ability itself. I think these sort of just random damage increases like this and the Necrolord one are sort of a cop-out, but hey, I guess in the end, it's better than nothing. Night Fae is positioned very well right now, and unless something changes, unless for whatever reason AF gets nerfed and Destro is like the best spec hands down on every fight next tier, and it's not even close, similar to what AF was this tier, I don't really see a reason to play anything with Night Fae at this point, barring big buffs or changes, because why would you? It's just the best, you know, if you're looking at playing more than one spec in basically every setting. So obviously I saved Necrolord with Decimating Bolt for last. Now I did say Venthyr is my favorite covenant outside of, well, it's Venthyr and Necrolord. They're really close. But unlike Night Fae and Venthyr and Kyrian, Necrolord is really interesting because it's the one covenant ability that changes what it does for each spec. So I think most everybody knows at this point that Necrolord is pretty good for destruction. It buffs the damage of your next 3 incinerates by 100%, and the bonus to the incinerate increases at the lower your target's health. Now that same damage amp is present for Destro, Demo, and Affliction. For Affliction, well, let's go to Affliction last, that's a nightmare. For Demonology, it buffs your next 3 demon bolts. Now, Incinerate can be havocked, and the big thing with Destro, and one of the reasons this actual covenant is very strong for Destro, is that Immolate, or Incinerate, well, I'm sorry, actually is more, it's a bigger part of your actual core, I guess, damage because of Roaring Blaze being a thing for Destruction Warlocks. Now, in single target, obviously you're casting a lot of incinerates. If you're playing the Cinders legendary, you can keep a pretty much a permanent uptime on Roaring Blaze, which means your incinerates are dealing 25% more damage for the course of the fight. If you're getting it buffed by Decimating Bolt, the next 3 incinerates, that stacking damage amp actually makes it pretty strong. On 2 target fights, when you have Havoc windows, having Roaring Blaze with Decimating Bolt, with Incinerates being buffed, and Conflict Race to squeeze them all in with bolts, it can make for some very big 2 target Havoc windows. It's very strong for Destro Lock, and also the fact that the soul binds are pretty good, hey, that's also a thing. Demonology is not in a bad spot. It's sort of like just a middle ground kind of thing, right? It buffs the damage of your next 3 demon bolts, which Demon Bolt is the harder hitting soul shard generator, or I guess resource generator. 2 shards versus 1. You're only casting it whenever you get a Demon Bolt proc, and there are a handful of things that increase Demon Bolt's damage even further. Sack souls, technically like inner demons or soul conduit, works a little bit from the shadows, which, by the way, the last video we put out from the shadows on PTR is now buffing demon fire, your tyrant's demon fire damage. This buff buffs that. So if that's actually a thing, I guess technically you can say Decimating Bolt does gain value because FTS might be played more, and that will, be active when you're actually casting your Demon Bolts with Decimating Bolt. And then that goes, into a snowball effect. You can play Carnivorous Stalkers for the extra uptime on FTS. It just sort of snowballs from there. But Demon Bolt is basically a single target ability. You're not going to gain any value AoE wise. Yeah, you can build more shards off it and implode, but that's something it does in itself. It doesn't need Decimating Bolt to actually do that. It's just a single target ability, and Demon Bolt is not a massive part of our damage like Incinerate is. Demon Bolt is just, I think like 5-6%. It can be buffed substantially, but that requires, once again, playing, the Demon Bolt legendary, Balespire's Burning Core, FTS, Sack Souls maybe. You can do it, but that build for the most part has been present right now, and the value is actually, it's just not really there. It's not a terrible covenant for Demo, but it's just not really the best. As far as AF goes, this is where the headache sort of begins with Decimating Bolt. Now, like I said, Necrolord is the one covenant that has different abilities in which Decimating Bolt buffs. Night Fae, Venthyr, Kyrian, they all do the same thing for the most part. Not looking at their actual conduits, they do the same thing. The way they interact with the spec might be a little different, but Night Fae is going to put up a dot. It's Soul Rot. It's going to give you Grove Invigoration for playing it. If you put up Scouring Tithe, you're going to get the dot effect. You can Havoc it and do things too, but it's always Scouring Tithe. It's always Soul Rot. It's always Impending Catastrophe. This changes, It's not some generic damage-based ability and that's it, right? So for Affliction, Decimating Bolt, if you're playing Drain Soul, buffs 1 Drain Soul. It used to be 3 on beta. If we change to Nightfall here and get Shadow Bolt back as our spender, you'll see it's 3 Shadow Bolts. Drain Soul is the only ability that it buffs 1 stack of. It used to buff Drain Soul to 3, but that's with the actual Malefic Wrath legendary, which, by the way, was buffed 2 weeks ago, increasing the duration and also the actual damage amp by 10% per stack. So 30% at 3 stacks, it was pretty OP. It also made AF's rotation feel incredibly complicated. You had such little time to do anything else but maintain an optimal rotation, or you were completely screwed over. Shadow's Embrace falls, 1 of 18 dots falls, and if you didn't finish your 3 Drain Soul casts fully, you lost so much damage because Drain Soul was your most powerful ability. It beat Malefic Rapture in damage, and we all know how OP Rapture is. So the buff or the nerf was certainly warranted. However, at this point, it's sort of fallen by the wayside because one Drain Soul is a very big difference between three. And well, you know, I mean, when you stack the execute part of Drain Soul, when you stack Malefic Wrath, and when you stack the actual ability here, it can sort of get out of hand. But the problem was, over the course of beta, it was nerfed from 3 stacks to 1 stack. Then they nerfed the actual damage amp that Decimating Bolt gives you from 200%. That was 200% to Incinerate, Demon Bolt, or Drain Soul. It went from 200 to 400. Basically 400 when the mob was dead, because it deals more damage to low health mobs. They nerfed it from 200 to 400 to 100 to 180%. So they completely gutted Decimating Bolt towards the end of beta, and really only made it good for 1 spec, you know, because you're not playing Shadow Bolt as Affliction. Like, Shadow's Embrace is a nightmare in the first place to maintain without Drain Soul. It's a pain even with Drain Soul. So plus Drain Soul, shard sniping into so much value, execute damage, it's all there. So the first thing I would like to see, it's really tough as far as tuning goes. This is more of an AF thing. I would like to see in some way this ability become, I guess, just better for AF. Because the thing is, the Drain Soul build was strong, like I said, but even with it being 1 stack of Drain Soul, it's very similar to how Malefic Wrath works in Mythic Plus, or I guess in PvE, right? It sims well. I believe this sims better than Agony, Shard Gen, in pure single target, but nobody plays it. Because it's, first of all, annoying rotationally to maintain the actual buff here to increase your Drain Soul. And number 2, especially when you have to finish 1 full Drain Soul cast on a patchwork boss, that's fine. You can do it for the most part, but on a fight like SLG, on like Council of Blood, on Sun King Salvation, good luck, man. Good luck getting a full drain off. Even if you do, which you can set up, let's be real here, but even if you do get that full drain off, it's nowhere near as impactful as it is on a patchwork boss, because you have 14 mobs running around on SLG, which is still a nightmare after 18 nerfs. On Sun King Salvation, most mobs die in half a second anyways. Like, it's hard to get the value out of Decimating Bolt with Malefic Wrath with Drain Soul. It's just a bit of a nightmare. It's really hard tuning wise because there's 18 damage amps you have to take into account. But I think a solid alternative to this is just to have it buff 2 stacks of Drain Soul. They'd have to work with the numbers because they just buff Malefic Wrath, but have it buff 2 stacks of Drain Soul. It wouldn't make it too OP, and also we were playing with 6 to 8% haste in beta. It wouldn't be as complicated as it was with 3 stacks, but it would make this version of AF a lot more rewarding. This is a single target version of AF though, because it's Drain Soul. You don't have much value later on. And like, trying to leverage a Decimating Bolt Drain Soul build in Plus, you can do it, sure, but you're interrupting a lot of your Drain Souls at times anyways. You can plan your big one, but you know what I'm saying? It's sort of like a niche, really strong single target build of AF versus like Night Fae being more AoE-ish, and obviously Venthyr being really heavy AoE, and I guess Kyrian sort of being in the middle, depending on how the actual value is. Now, they could adjust the actual damage amp on Decimating Bolt as well, because once again, I'll launch it here, it'll be like 100%. They did make a recent change, giving it, like, it's hard to explain, but it increases my damage by 100 here. If this mob was at 99%, it'd be like 103%. It previously was, it wouldn't kick up to like 103% or whatever until the mob hit 80%. So they buffed it a tiny bit. I think they buffed the actual impact damage of the, I guess, missiles a tiny bit, but I just think it needs something for AF. It's competitive for Destro, it's fine for Demo, but AF, it just sort of feels lacking, which is unfortunate because it's a strong ability and it really gives AF like a niche like toolkit, you know? It's really strong execute damage, which, you know, Warlocks don't really have. Drain Soul, like, yeah, okay, the damage is there for execute, it doubles its damage, but who cares? It doesn't do anything in the first place, right? But having Drain Soul with Malefic Wrath, with Decimating Bolt, you wouldn't have as strong of a single target profile early on in the fight, but when you hit that execute, Warlocks would suddenly bring a lot to a fight. That is an ability I could see somebody swapping to for a final boss, or for a boss that has a really tight execute check. Maybe like Sire, or like, you know, Fallen Avatar, right? Where you have to have that hard execute damage. That might even warrant a Covenant swap if a boss is a really, really tight DPS check, similar to what we saw from a handful of Boomkins and things on Sludgefist in the Race to World First progression. That could be a thing. But in this form, it's just not going to do it. It just needs help. It needs tuning. And that's something where Blizzard's just going to have to actually put the work into. As far as the actual conduit goes for this ability, this used to be different, and honestly, I don't even remember what it did. It was called Prolonged Decimation. I think it increased the value of, what did Prolonged Decimation do? Okay, this is a little awkward. Normally I don't do this, but what did Prolonged Decimation do? Prolonged Decimation used to, I think it increased the damage of your drain even more. What did it do? I can't find it here. It was changed in pretty much like late in beta, and it made it so that it just deals more damage the missiles do, which is super awkward because let's be real here, like it doesn't really matter much, right? Like, I mean, the missiles deal roughly 620 like damage, which is I guess about the same as 2 incinerates, but that's incinerates without, I can't find prolonged decimation. I don't know what it was, but it was better before. That's basically like 2 incinerates before roaring blaze and before the actual decimating bolt itself has been cast for the damage amp. The missiles don't do a crazy amount of damage, and it's a 45-second cooldown. I guess the conduit's never dead because they're always casting it, but it just doesn't seem very strong. I guess an 80% increase is pretty relevant. It's like 3.5 incinerates technically, but it just doesn't seem like it's that big of a deal. Okay, I'm gonna find what prolonged decimation did. Give me a second here, boys. Right, I found it. Fatal decimation. Shadow Bolt or Drain Soul had a 10% chance to not consume a charge of decimating bolt. So you can sort of see why this got tuned on PTR and beta, because the damage increase was 200 to 400. You had a chance of not consuming a stack. It was 3 stacks of Drain Soul, and Malefic Grasp also a thing. You can see why it needed a bit of tuning, but it just seems like Blizzard was like, we don't know how to tune this, just gut it and destroy it for AF, and we'll look at it later on. So I'm hoping that not that later on is 9.0.5 or 9.1, because going from a conduit like this, where it gives you a chance to get another drain off compared to like this, it quite literally just feels like we don't know what we're doing, like tuning wise. Just increase the damage of the missiles and just forget it. That's fine. Like I don't, how you go from something being that like that in depth, just here's a damage increase, just go. I don't really know. I get that, yes, incinerate stacks with roaring blaze. I get that Drain Soul, decimating bolt, wrath, all the stacking is pretty OP, and I sort of get how Demo had a lot of stacking abilities too, but I'm not the one that designed the ability. They did, so they should be able to tune around it. Either way, I'm not a huge fan of decimation. I like to see a shift back to prolonged decimation, but I mean, I assume this is probably what we're going to get, so I don't really have a suggestion for this conduit. Increase the damage. I don't know. It seems so generic, so cut and dry. But as far as Necrolord goes, Covenant wise, it's good for Destro. It's fine for Demo. There very well might be some kind of build that emerges with FTS being a thing now, like for tyrants and stuff. It might actually be worthwhile, and it can be good for AF. All it really needs is a bit of tuning. I think that maybe having 2 stacks of Drain Soul from decimating bolt instead of 1 could do it, but I haven't run the math on it. I'm gonna leave it up to Blizzard, and hopefully I can play my second favorite, maybe favorite Covenant, maybe at some point in the expansion, but we'll see. Thanks for watching, dudes. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and hopefully you guys agree with some of the points that I brought up as far as Covenant tuning goes. Now, this is basically the last day or so of February. I assume we're probably going to have at least 2 more builds of 9.0.5 on PTR. Probably 2. I'm assuming we're probably going to see a release at some point. Probably, I'm looking at the 3rd week of March, the 17th, I think. Whatever week corresponds to the dungeon event beginning, I'm sort of putting my money on, because hey, like Valor and dungeons, it sort of makes sense. It could be earlier, but Blizzard has indeed said they want it out somewhere in the middle of March, and then I would assume pretty quickly after we probably get into 9.1 PTR for the new raid testing, and well, I assume we see more changes there as well. Either way, I'm happy that Blizzard is putting these changes out now and trying to make them in advance before 9.1 hits, because let's be real here, nobody by the way, take a shot, boys, nobody wants to be changing covenants a week before launch. Nobody wants to be grinding out renown 40 the week heroic opens, because there's going to be 40 more renown levels coming out as well, apparently. Found out today, and that's just going to be a nightmare. So I like the effort that Blizzard's putting forward when it comes to tuning these abilities. I just hope they get it right, and hopefully it's not too late for them. Once again, let me know what you guys think of these suggested changes in the comment section below. Any questions, feel free to drop them there as well. I will be sure to get back to you. If you guys want to see more WoW content and help support the channel, be sure to smash the like and subscribe buttons below. Thanks again, dudes, and I'll catch you all again soon on stream. Peace.